This hour on i24 News. President Trump's all-new travel ban, this time encompassing 8 countries, some new, some old. Why some experts are saying it still doesn't fly.
Protests erupted on Capitol Hill as Senate Republicans held a hearing on their latest effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, but the bill once again faces crucial opposition from within the GOP.
And the votes are in for the Kurdish independence referendum, how the results could impact Iraq's relationships with countries far and wide.
From the i24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Michelle McCory.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The U.S. Republican Party's last-ditch effort to repeal and replace Obamacare hanging by a thread.
A revised version of the Graham-Cassidy bill was circulated to Senate Republicans with the aim of winning over some key votes, but once again, there is opposition within the party. And on this day, it all came amidst a dramatic protest on Capitol Hill. Correspondent Daniel Backus has the latest.
I'd like to welcome everyone, and I do mean everyone.
Before the Senate Finance Committee hearing could even begin, protesters were removed, some from their wheelchairs, as they chanted in anger over a newly revised health care bill.
A lot of us are on your side, so just let's have some order.
This new health care bill, known as the Graham-Cassidy bill, would give states more flexibility to craft their own health coverage, but with far less federal funding and with no guarantee of how they would cover Americans with pre-existing conditions. It also adds money and newly eased coverage requirements aimed at winning over senators who could vote against it.
When it comes to Obamacare, if you don't find a way to stop the bleeding, then it's going to basically collapse.
Over the weekend, GOP Senators Rand Paul and John McCain already saying they'll say no. Senator Susan Collins and Ted Cruz also completely not on board. Concerns were also raised over the last-minute changes to the bill.
I just don't think when you're talking about a bill of this magnitude and our colleague saying he believes that this is the final version, that that's good enough when we're talking about putting at risk millions of Americans.
Monday morning, President Trump on the Rick and Bubba show acknowledging that they may not have the votes needed to replace Obamacare before the September 30th deadline.
We have 52 votes, so we can't lose any votes.
And thanks to correspondent Dana Backus. For more on this and all things Washington, let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv, Tom Borelli, contributor at the Conservative Review, and i24 News senior national correspondent, Michael Shore. And thank you all very much for being with us. And Dan, I want to start with you just to get an update. We heard that Senator Susan Collins saying that she's not going to go for it. So is this a fatal blow now?
Yes, it is. At the end of that report, we heard President Trump say recently, we have 52 Republican senators, so we can't lose any. Well, in fact, they could lose 2. If they got 50 votes, then Vice President Mike Pence would be the tie-breaking vote and a bill would pass. So they could lose 2. Now, they already had lost. John McCain of Arizona and Rand Paul of Kentucky, they already said they would vote no for very different reasons, but they did not like this so-called reform bill for health insurance. And now Susan Collins of Maine has announced that she also will vote no. In her case, frankly, she thought this bill was too conservative, too rough and on people who actually need Medicaid, people who don't have much money. And the authors of the bill tried to sweeten it specifically for her state of Maine. Susan Collins apparently was not impressed by that and then announced that she'd vote no. That usually means that the Senate won't even bother to vote, but maybe they will try Wednesday, possibly Thursday. But it sure looks like it's not going to happen, Michelle.
And Michael, sure to boil the bill down, which is always dangerous, but the bottom line was that they decided to essentially give block grants to the states, but to pair that with making pretty dramatic cuts in terms of federal funding to programs like Medicaid. Is that about right?
That is about right. I mean, again, like you said, in fairness to you, David, you can't really boil this down completely, but that's pretty much the case. And, you know, I think one of the big problems, too, was that they weren't able to figure out how the states were able to pick up the balance of federal money that wouldn't go there and how they would cover pre-existing conditions. And that, to so many of these senators was a big problem. I wouldn't be surprised, David, to see Mitch McConnell actually pull this bill. I don't see it happening before Wednesday because there's a special election, a runoff in Alabama tomorrow. I don't think he wants to get into the weeds there, but I would be surprised if this bill actually ever gets voted on. I think you'll see a few more people peel away. This Collins, McCain, even Ted Cruz gives an opening to other senators not to support this bill, and that is really what it's about. It's about the states not being able to figure out how to make up the difference.
Now, Tom, for years when President Obama was in office, Republicans were campaigning. They were promising that they were going to repeal and replace Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Why have they not been able to get it together?
You're absolutely right, Michelle. And the Republicans, if they don't do this bill, they really deserve a big fat F. Because, as you mentioned, for years they have promised to repeal it and then do something else. They even backtracked on the repeal. So this is even a fallback. And I think there probably will be political consequences. And I do hope that they do put it up for a vote so the American people can actually see what these senators are for or against and then be held accountable. We want to see them stand up and vote and hear their rationale.
Michelle, can I just add to what Tom's saying? The repeal, they've done a pretty good job at pushing that. It's the replace that they didn't do well, and that's the thing that's going to affect voters. You know, Susan Collins, even today of Maine, saying that one of her biggest problems was she was presented this bill and all its changes the week they were supposed to vote on it before they could even get any budget analysis. The Republicans from the very get-go have done a very poor job as a party in crafting what replace is. They've done a very good job at reminding everyone about repeal, but the other part was a big part of their efforts. And again, Tom's right. It's good that they're going to get an F, but mostly on replace.
And Tom, on the replace aspect, if it was so important to cut Medicaid to all these various states, why then add in money? Well, I know the answer, but you explain to me. Why was it such a good idea to add Medicaid money into Alaska? Because, again, that's one of the key components of Obamacare is the Medicaid expansion.
Right. Well, obviously, it was an effort to buy votes. Let's not, duck that issue. I mean, Obamacare passed by the Louisiana Purchase and some other kickback. Remember all that?
No, but go ahead.
Trust me, it happened. So they bought votes that way. This is unfortunately what goes on in Washington. But again, I think this is a problem for Republicans because they had promised for so long to do this. And it really required leadership. And unfortunately, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, as the majority leader, I think he gets the biggest of the F because he's the one who's supposed to rally the troops. As soon as Trump got elected, they should have had plans in place, and they didn't.
My point was, and Dan, I'll throw it over to you, is it put the Republicans in a really awkward spot when on the one hand they're campaigning and saying, hey, we have to get rid of Obamacare, but in order to get rid of Obamacare, they actually have to protect a key component of Obamacare with at least 1 or 2 or 3 senators.
But they did not want to keep the following component, requiring all Americans to purchase health insurance. Democrats said that's a very natural thing to do. Everyone has to get a driver's license and insure their cars if they own a car. So why not have to buy health insurance? And that way, if everyone took part, that would keep the cost lower. Republicans never bought that idea. Frankly, the insurance industry kind of liked the idea. Wow, hundreds of millions of customers, everybody would buy, but it didn't work out. Obamacare has a lot of problems. It is working, it is operating, but here's another little trap that's about to come. The annual period for signing up for Obamacare, right? If you're not covered by your job with health insurance, and so you need to buy it on the exchanges, well, yeah, that still exists, that marketplace of Obamacare, but perhaps you've noticed the Department of Health and Social Security is not Health and Human Services is not advertising that fact. It's almost as though the Trump administration wants Obamacare to fail and certainly is not trying its very best to improve it, kind of daring the Democrats to step forward and start working with Republicans, though I just don't see it happening in Congress, at least not this year. They won't work on health reform. I think it's dead for the year.
Tom, why this Republican opposition to the concept of having mandatory health care for everyone? As Dan said, you have to have a driver's license. Why not have a fine for those that don't have health insurance, if not forcing them to buy it?
Well, Actually, there was a fine with Obamacare, and it turns out that many Americans chose to pay the fine rather than the insurance, up to $3 billion.
In a Republican plan, and then at least that adds to cutting down the costs.
Because Republicans generally don't like mandates. Thou shall from the federal government. Thou shall do this, thou shall do that. Everything from light bulbs to mandatory coverage, and Obamacare mandated certain forms of coverage. In fact, everybody had to buy this plan, which boosted up the cost. So again, it's more, Republicans should be, and conservatives, more about free choice, individuality, and let people decide rather than the strong federal government mandating everything.
Now, Tom, in the middle of all of this, we've got the news about the president expanding his travel ban, and now to include Chad, Venezuela, and North Korea. The president says that individual laws or procedures are going to apply to the country separately according to who can and can't come in, but that overall the idea is to protect Americans and to ensure a stricter vetting process of those coming into the country. What do you make of it? Do you think it'll work?
I think it's a great plan, and in fact, what the government did, Homeland Security, they set up minimum standards that these countries had to meet for vetting their own citizens, and if countries couldn't meet those standards, or even some of these countries didn't even try, they didn't make the list. I think they started with 50 countries, and then they got it down to what is about 8. But I think the most important thing is the process. They set up standards of which countries had to follow, so it wasn't just random. So these countries can actually, if they meet some standards, they can get their people back in.
And by including North Korea, you can get away from the argument that this is a ban targeting mostly Muslim countries, because North Korea obviously isn't. But
and Venezuela as well.
But Michael Schur, are we looking at a week where right now politically perhaps the only victory for the Trump administration is that the Supreme Court has announced they're not going to hear this challenge to the travel ban? At a week when it looks like health care is going to fail, it looks like the Republican establishment candidate in the U.S. Senate race in Alabama is going to lose. I mean, these are setbacks for the Trump administration.
These are definitely setbacks. And listen, I mean, I think that there may be new challenges raised in lower courts to this travel ban, because initially the administration said this was a temporary ban. Everything that's been enacted thus far rings of permanence, and I think that's going to be a problem for some justices, and I think there are already lawyers looking at ways around that. And yes, if Luther Strange, the sitting senator right now from Alabama, were to lose tomorrow night, even though Donald Trump has already hedged his bets and said he'll support whoever wins that race, it would be a defeat for him. He went down there to try and get Strange elected. And the opposition candidate, Roy Moore, I mean, I just listened to Tom say, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Republicans not liking that. He's the candidate who wanted to keep the 10 Commandments on the steps of the Supreme Court in Alabama and Montgomery. So they wanted those thou shalt nots, but they don't always want the other thou shalt nots. And Donald Trump is going to have a difficult week if some of these things come through.
Luther Strange, that almost sounds like a supervillain name. I can't get over that name.
Well, in the Friday night rally for for Luther Strange, this is the one that got the president in so much hot water with the National Football League. And it takes a special skill to be able to make the National Football League commissioner look like a hero and make the NFL look good when that's a league everybody hates.
But at the end of the day, the NFL is going to come off very bad when you go against patriotism, you go against the American flag. Viewership is down. I think there's going to be huge. It's basic marketing. You don't do anything to damage your brand, and you certainly don't upset your customers.
Well, it seems like everybody's, many people are pointing at the hypocrisy of the NFL, because when certain players wanted to wear pink ribbons or a pink token in support of breast cancer, that wasn't allowed. When there were Dallas Cowboys wanted to stickers in support of the police, that wasn't allowed. So some hypocrisy is being said with the NFL commissioner saying no, now protecting the right for self-expression.
Michael Schur, you wanted to weigh in.
Well, yeah, first of all, I think that the ratings in the NFL are actually quite strong. And I think after tonight's Dallas game playing on a Monday night, the ratings are going to go through the roof. So that argument doesn't really hold water.
Actually, sir, that they do. It's down 16%. The Giant Philadelphia game was down 16%.
In the first week, they said because of Hurricane Irma. It's still the
there was
most
no hurricane
watched,
yesterday.
It was still the most watched sport in America. Everybody watches football. It is why every network wants to cover the NFL. So and it doesn't really matter. Already, Villanueva on the Steelers, who came out, was the only player on his team because he was an Iraq War veteran to hold his hand over. He said he's embarrassed that he did it. He feels terrible about it. I think this is an argument that's going to be lost by the administration, and the NFL's probably taking the right route, and maybe it'll lead to Colin Kaepernick getting signed at some point because there are a lot of bad quarterbacks in the league.
Wow.
Well, it used to be that football was the one thing that could unify us and help us get over some of our divisions because it was merely about which team you favored. Now we have the situation where the president has used this as sort of a divisive wedge, and it seems kind of sad.
Well, it is sad, but I bring it back to the commissioner. It's up to him to defend the brand of the NFL. It's $1 billion brand, and he's upsetting his customers. Yeah, it's not a good business.
He was upsetting them, Tom, long before this happened. The NFL stinks. The way they broadcast games. You gotta go. I got to get you Redzone. Get Redzone, then you don't have to watch any of this nonsense. You can watch 4 games at once, just the highlights in the Redzone. We're going to work on it for you, Tom, and then you're going to like the NFL.
It doesn't mean that President Trump had to weigh in and to be another source of division. I don't know why Trump wanted to have this particular argument, but he doesn't seem to mind. And keep in mind, the White House says that he's in favor of the flag and the national anthem. The president's not against anybody or anything, so said the White House.
Well, it may be giving him too much credit, but some are saying that it could be a Trump strategic move to talk about this and distract from the failure of health reform and some other issues that haven't really worked out. But we're going to have to leave it there. Senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv, thank you. Tom Borelli, contributor at the Conservative Review, and senior national correspondent Michael Shore. Thanks to all of you.
Coming up on Crossroads, the